What if I told you that just one single skill could determine the vast majority of your success in life? That's the core promise of a book that has literally shaped leaders for decades, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And today, we're going to break down its most powerful and often pretty surprising principles.
So let's just jump right in with a question. What's the one skill that you think determines a whopping 85% of your financial success? Is it your technical know-how, your work ethic, maybe that fancy degree you have? Well, the answer, it's probably not what you're thinking. According to research from the Carnegie Foundation, a staggering 85% of financial success has nothing to do with technical knowledge. Think about that. Even in super technical fields like engineering, your actual expertise only accounts for about 15% of your success. The other 85%, well, that comes down to something else entirely. That skill is what Carnegie called human engineering, which is kind of an old school term, I know, but what it really means is your personality and your ability to lead and just deal with people. That is what this whole book is about. It's a handbook on human relations. So let's get into the first and maybe the most difficult principle of all. Okay, this first principle, it goes against our most natural, most impulsive, and honestly, most destructive habit, criticism. Carnegie is crystal clear on this. If you want to influence people, you have got to stop criticizing, condemning, and complaining. And why? Well, because it just doesn't work. So who do you think said this? It wasn't some misunderstood artist or philanthropist. Nope, that was Al Capone, America's most notorious gangster. He genuinely saw himself as a public benefactor who just wasn't appreciated. And Carnegie's point here is so profound. If Al Capone saw himself that way, what does that say about the everyday people you deal with? Criticism is only going to make them defensive because in their own mind, they're the good guy. And that's the central problem, right? When you criticize someone, they don't change their mind. They just dig in their heels, justify what they did, and start to resent you for it. Carnegie had this perfect analogy for this. He said, criticism is like a homing pigeon. It always comes back home to you, and usually it's carrying resentment that can last for years. So the key then is self-control. And listen, even the greats struggled with this. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln was absolutely furious that his general let the enemy army escape. He sat down and wrote this scathing letter, just ready to tear him apart. But then, he paused. He put himself in his general's shoes, on a bloody battlefield, tired. And he realized the letter would do nothing but create bitterness. He never sent it. Lincoln understood that a moment of anger just wasn't worth the long-term cost. Look, any fool can criticize, and let's be honest, most of us do. But like the writer Thomas Carlyle said, real greatness is shown in how you treat people, especially when they mess up. It takes true character to be understanding and forgiving. And you know what? It's way more effective. Just look at the story of the famous test pilot Bob Hoover. After an emergency landing caused by a mechanic putting the wrong fuel in his plane, Hoover didn't yell, he didn't fire the young man. He saw the guy was absolutely devastated. So instead, he put his arm around him and showed total faith, ensuring that mechanic would be the most careful, dedicated person on his team from that day on. Now that's the power of replacing criticism with understanding. Okay, so if criticism is what we shouldn't do, what's the alternative? Well, this brings us to the real heart of positive influence, giving genuine appreciation and making a radical shift in your perspective. Carnegie uses this simple but honestly perfect analogy. He personally loved strawberries and cream. But when he went fishing, did he bait the hook with strawberries? Of course not. He used worms because that's what the fish wants. It's so obvious, right? So why on earth do we almost always use the bait we like when we're fishing for people? And this leads to what is probably the single most important secret of influence in the whole book. You can't force anyone to do anything. You have to make them want to do it. And that means you have to shift your focus entirely, away from your goals and onto theirs, and then figure out how to build a bridge between the two. This story from the book just nails the principle perfectly. A boy's parents were at their wits' end because he kept wetting the bed. Shaming him, punishing him, none of it worked. So they stopped. They asked, what does he want? Turns out he wanted to be a grown-up just like his dad. So they helped him buy his own bed and his own pajamas. Suddenly his pride was on the line. It was his bed, and he promised not to wet it. And just like that, the problem was solved. They aligned their goal with his desire. All right, so how do we apply these ideas in one of the toughest situations we all face? Disagreements. Carnegie's advice here is pretty radical, but it's so wise. He basically argues that the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it completely. As Benjamin Franklin put it, you can't really win. I mean, think about it. If you lose the argument, you lose. But even if you win and you tear their argument to shreds, all you've done is make them feel inferior, and you've hurt their pride. You get this temporary, theatrical victory, but you lose their goodwill, which is probably what you actually wanted in the first place. So instead of going into battle, Carnegie gives us a playbook. Welcome the disagreement. See it as a chance to learn something. Control your temper and really, truly listen. Try to find common ground, be honest enough to admit where you might be wrong, and promise to genuinely think about their points. This whole approach completely disarms people and can turn an enemy into a partner. Now, a really powerful technique here is to channel your inner Socrates. Start by focusing only on the things you both agree on. Ask gentle questions that get them saying yes right from the beginning. By building this foundation of agreement, you create this positive momentum that makes it so much easier to guide them toward your conclusion without ever having a fight. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. So let's try to distill all of this down into a simple, actionable playbook that you can start using, well, today. These are the 4 huge principles we've explored. First, just resist that powerful urge to criticize. Second, actively look for reasons to give honest, sincere appreciation. Third, always think in terms of the other person's interests. Bait the hook to suit the fish. And fourth, turn arguments into conversations by looking for agreement, not for a fight. And that really brings us to the end. The real power here isn't in knowing these principles, it's in actually living them. So my question for you is pretty simple. Which one of these principles will you try today? Because the answer could literally change everything.